The morning the whisper reached the marble halls of Veldenmark, it did not arrive as a shout. It came the way the most dangerous news always does, quietly, folded into the corner of a courtier's mouth, passed from one bowed head to the next, until it filled the palace like smoke under a door. By the time the sun had climbed over the eastern towers, every servant, every guard, every minister knew the same impossible thing. King Aldrich was preparing to strip his own wife of her crown. And no one, not even the woman who wore it, understood why. Queen Consort Rosalind had spent 11 years learning to be loved by a country that had never wanted her. She remembered the beginning of it all too well, the way the newspapers had sharpened their pens when Aldrich first announced he would marry her. She had not been the people's choice. She had not been anyone's choice except his. There had been another woman before her, a princess adored across the realm, whose early death had left the kingdom grieving and Aldrich hollow. When he turned, years later, to the quiet widow who had stood beside him through that grief, the country did not celebrate. They compared. They resented. They called Rosalind the woman who had taken a beloved's place, though she had done nothing but wait and love and stay. So she had worked. God, how she had worked. She learned the names of every charity, memorized the faces of every mayor, stood in the rain at ribbon cuttings when younger royals stayed home. Slowly, year by year, the country's frost had begun to thaw, not into warmth, perhaps, but into respect. And respect, she had told herself, was a foundation strong enough to build a life on. Which was why the summons from the king's private study, delivered by a page who would not meet her eyes, filled her with a dread she could not name. Aldrich was standing at the window when she entered. He did not turn. The light caught the gray at his temples, the stoop that had crept into his shoulders in the last hard year, the year of his illness, the year the whole kingdom had held its breath while doctors came and went, and no one spoke plainly about what was wrong. "You wanted to see me," she said. "Sit, Rosalind." She did not sit. Something in his voice told her that sitting would make it real. He turned then, and she saw that he had aged a decade in a season. "There is no way to say this that will not wound you," he began, "so I will say it plainly, because you have always deserved plainness from me even when I could not give it." He drew a slow breath. "I am going to petition the council to revoke your title. You will no longer be Queen Consort of Veldenmark." The words did not land at first. They hovered in the air between them, too large to fit inside her understanding. "I don't," she started and stopped. "Aldrich, what are you saying? What have I done?" "Nothing," the word cracked as it left him. "You have done nothing. That is the cruelty of it. You have been the finest queen this country has had in 100 years, and I am about to take it from you." "Then why?" He looked at her for a long moment, and in his eyes she saw something she had not seen in all their years together, not anger, not coldness, but fear. Raw, bottomless fear. "Because if I do not," he said, "they will destroy you the moment I am gone, and I would rather break your heart myself than leave you to be broken by wolves." The room seemed to tilt. Rosalind reached for the back of a chair to steady herself. "What wolves? Aldrich, you are frightening me. Tell me what is happening." But he only shook his head. "Not yet. There are things I must set in motion first, things I cannot undo once begun. When it is safe, you will understand everything. Until then, I need you to trust me, and I know I have no right to ask it." She should have argued. She should have demanded answers, refused to accept a sentence handed down without a crime. But she had loved this man for 11 years, and she knew the shape of his face when he was lying, and this was not that. This was a man drowning, reaching for her hand even as he pushed her away. "How long," she managed, "before the council hears the petition?" "A fortnight. A fortnight. 14 days to prepare for the unmaking of her entire life." She left the study without another word, because she did not trust herself to speak, and walked the long corridors of the only home she had known back to her own chambers, past portraits of queens who had come before her, women whose crowns had never been questioned, whose right to belong had never been put to a vote. It was there, in the privacy of her rooms, that she found the letter. It had been slipped beneath her door, plain paper, no seal, the handwriting unfamiliar and hurried. She almost did not open it, her mind too full to hold anything more. But something about its plainness caught her, the same instinct that had told her in the study that Aldrich was not lying. She broke the fold and read 4 lines that turned the ground beneath her to water. "The king does not act of his own will. He is being made to choose between your crown and your life. Trust no one at court, least of all the man who smiles widest. I will find you when it is safe." A friend who owes your husband everything. Rosalind read it 3 times. Then she crossed to the fireplace, held the corner of the paper to the flame, and watched it curl into ash, because whoever had written it was right about one thing at least. Someone at court was her enemy, and until she knew who, the only safe words were the ones no one else could ever read. Outside her window, the sun climbed higher over Veldenmark, gilding the towers, warming the stones. Somewhere below, a bell began to ring for morning prayers, ordinary and sweet, as though the world had not just cracked down its center. Rosalind pressed her hand flat against the cold glass and made herself a promise. She would not go quietly. Whatever was coming for her, whatever wolves her husband feared, whatever hand was closing around his throat and forcing his, she would find it first. She would learn its name, and she would look it in the eyes before it ever laid a claw on her. The woman the country had called an interloper, a replacement, a mistake, that woman was about to become something none of them expected. She was about to fight. The first rule Rosalind set herself was the hardest. She would let them believe she was already beaten. It went against everything in her. Every instinct screamed to confront, to demand, to march into the council chamber, and dare them to explain why an innocent woman should be stripped of a crown she had bled for. But the letter's warning had lodged in her like a splinter. Trust no one at court, least of all the man who smiles widest. And she understood with a cold clarity that surprised her that a cornered animal who bares its teeth only tells the hunter where to aim. So she wept where they could see her. She let her ladies find her red-eyed at breakfast, let the whispers travel that the Queen Consort had collapsed into grief and would not fight the petition. She played the part of a woman surrendering, and she played it well, because a lifetime of being watched had taught her exactly how to perform for an audience. And while she performed, she listened. The court of Veldenmark was a machine of 1,000 moving parts, and Rosalind had spent 11 years learning where each one sat. She knew which chamberlain drank, which lady-in-waiting sold secrets to the papers, which guards could be trusted and which could be bought. Now she turned all of it, every scrap of knowledge she had gathered in the quiet years of being underestimated, toward a single question: who had the power to force a king's hand? The answer, when it began to take shape, made her blood run cold. It started with the Lord Chancellor, the man who smiled widest. Chancellor Merrick had served 3 monarchs and buried 2. He had a face built for reassurance, soft and paternal, the kind of face that made frightened people feel safe. He had been the first to comfort Rosalind when Aldrich fell ill, the first to press her hand and murmur that the kingdom was in steady hands. She had been grateful to him then. She had thought him kind. Now she watched him, truly watched him, and saw the way the ministers fell silent when he entered a room. Saw how the king's illness had left a vacuum, and how neatly Merrick had filled it, signing in Aldrich's name, speaking in Aldrich's stead, deciding which visitors reached the king's bedside and which were turned away with gentle regret. In the long months of Aldrich's sickness, the chancellor had not seized power. He had simply become the door through which all power now passed. And a man who controls every door soon forgets he does not own the house. But suspicion was not proof, and Rosalind knew that a queen accusing a beloved chancellor without evidence would only prove the court's worst opinion of her. She needed more. She needed the truth, whole and undeniable, and she needed the friend who had written to her in the dark. He came on the 9th night. She had almost given up on him. 9 days of watching, of playing the broken woman, of lying awake tracing conspiracies across her ceiling, and then a soft knock at the servant's entrance to her chambers, 3 taps and a pause and a 4th. And when she opened the door, it was a face she knew but had never truly seen. Tomas, the king's old valet. A man who had dressed Aldrich every morning for 30 years, who moved through the palace like furniture, invisible because he had always been there. "You," she breathed. "Forgive me, your majesty. 9 days was as fast as I dared. Merrick has eyes everywhere, and a man seen twice where he shouldn't be is a man who disappears." He slipped inside, and she saw that his hands were shaking. "I served your husband before you ever came to court. I owe him everything, my position, my son's schooling, my very life once, in a winter you'll not have heard of. When I tell you what is happening, you'll understand why I've risked mine to say it." What Tomas told her, in the low and hurried voice of a man who knew every minute cost him, rearranged the world. Aldrich was not merely ill. He was being poisoned, slowly, cleverly, in doses calculated to mimic the wasting sickness the doctors had named. And the poison came through the one channel no one thought to question, the medicines Merrick's own physician prepared. The Chancellor had spent a year hollowing the king out from the inside, and now, with Aldrich weak and failing and desperate, he had made his true move. "There is a document," Tomas whispered. "A succession decree. Merrick has drafted it and pressures the king to sign. It names a regency council to rule after Aldrich's death, headed by Merrick himself, on the grounds that the heir is too young and the queen consort, he swallowed, unfit, foreign-born, unpopular, a danger to the stability of the crown. Those are the words written of you, Majesty. To justify shutting you out entirely, they must first strip your title. A queen has standing to challenge a regency. A discarded consort has none." And there it was, the whole monstrous shape of it revealed at last. Aldrich had not turned against her. He had seen the trap closing and made the only move a cornered king could make, to revoke her title himself publicly as a devastating act of rejection, so that Merrick would believe he had won and lower his guard. To the court it looked like cruelty. To Merrick it looked like victory. But it was neither. It was a dying man buying his wife time and taking the blow of the world's contempt onto himself so that she might live to fight another day. "I would rather break your heart myself than leave you to be broken by wolves." She understood him now, and understanding him, she felt the grief and the fury braid together into something harder than either. "The physician," she said, "the one who prepares the medicines, can he be turned?" Tomas shook his head. "He is Merrick's creature to the bone." "Then we do not turn him, we catch him." Rosalind was already moving, already thinking 3 steps ahead, the performance of the broken woman falling away like a discarded cloak. "A poisoner leaves a trail, Tomas. Ingredients must be bought, doses must be measured. Somewhere in this palace there is a record, a supply, a single thread that when pulled unravels the whole tapestry. We have 5 days before the council hears the petition. 5 days to find proof that turns Merrick's weapon back upon him. And if we fail..." She met his eyes. "Then I lose my crown, my husband loses his life, and a murderer rules Veldenmark in a child's name, so we will not fail." She drew a breath. "Tomas, the friend who wrote to me, that was you." The old man's weathered face creased. "It was, Majesty." "You signed it a friend who owes your husband everything." She reached out, and for the first time in her life as queen, took a servant's trembling hand in both of her own. "Then let us make certain his faith in you and mine was not misplaced." Beyond her windows, the 9th night deepened over Veldenmark, and somewhere in the sleeping palace a chancellor smiled in his dreams, certain of a victory he had already begun quietly to lose. 5 days is nothing, and it is everything. It is time enough to lose a kingdom or save one, depending on the nerve of the hands that hold it, and Rosalind's hands, for the first time in 11 years, had stopped shaking. They began in the dark and worked in the margins. Tomas moved through the palace's forgotten passages, the servants' arteries that carried the whole body of the court and were seen by no one who mattered. Rosalind gave him the map of her knowledge, every weakness she had catalogued in her quiet years, every debt owed, every grudge held, and Tomas turned that map into a net. The first thread came from the kitchens. A scullery maid, dismissed months ago for theft she swore she never committed, remembered the physician's assistant coming for boiled water at odd hours, carrying vials he would let no one else touch. Dismissed and bitter, she had every reason to talk, and Tomas had coin enough to loosen her tongue. The second thread came from the ledgers. Every purchase the palace made passed through the quartermaster's books, and buried in a year of ordinary entries, flour, candles, linen, wine, were small, regular acquisitions of a compound used in tiny amounts to treat weak hearts and in larger ones to stop them. Ordered under Merrick's seal, delivered to Merrick's physician, signed for in a hand that matched no medical purpose the doctors had ever declared for the king. The third thread, the one that bound the others into a rope strong enough to hang a chancellor, Rosalind found herself. She found it by doing the one thing Merrick had never accounted for. She went to her husband, not as a wounded wife, not as a queen demanding answers, but as a conspirator with a plan. She waited until the deepest hour of the night, when Merrick's watchers grew heavy-eyed, and she went to Aldrich's chambers by the servants' door, and she woke the king and told him everything she knew. She watched hope and horror war across his ravaged face. "You were meant to stay away," he rasped. "You were meant to be safe." "I have never once been safe," she said, "and I am done pretending otherwise. Aldrich, the decree, the one he's pressing you to sign. Where is it kept?" Understanding kindled in his fevered eyes. "In his study, in the locked case behind his desk with the seal he uses to sign in my name." His hand found hers, thin and burning. "Rosalind, if he catches you." He won't catch me. He'll be too busy being caught. Here was the plan, whole and audacious. They would let the council convene. They would let Merrick stand before the assembled ministers, radiant with false grief, and present his petition to revoke the Queen Consort's title. They would let him climb all the way to the summit of his ambition. And then Rosalind would walk into that chamber with the poison ledgers in one hand and the truth in the other, and pull the whole mountain down on top of him. But for that she needed the decree itself. The document in Merrick's own hand, naming his regency, written in the words that condemned her. Because a poisoner might be explained away, a physician might be blamed and discarded, but a man who had drafted the machinery of his own coup could not deny the paper his ambition had signed. The theft fell to Tomas, who had spent 30 years learning which floorboards spoke. On the fourth night he entered the Chancellor's study through a passage even Merrick had forgotten, opened the locked case with a key copied in wax, and carried out the decree pressed flat against his chest beneath his coat. He did not breathe until he was 3 corridors away. He did not stop shaking until he laid it in Rosalind's hands. She read it by candlelight, and every word was exactly as Tomas had promised. The regency, the exclusion of the heir, the vicious little clauses declaring the Queen Consort foreign, unfit, a danger to be set aside. Her own unmaking, drafted by a murderer's pen. She folded it carefully and placed it with the ledgers, and she did not weep because she was past weeping now. She was ready. The Council of Veldenmark convened at midday beneath the great vaulted ceiling where 100 years of the kingdom's decisions had been made. The ministers filed in, grave and murmuring. The young heir sat pale and uncertain in his oversized chair. And Chancellor Merrick rose, resplendent in his robes of office, his wide and paternal smile arranged for the occasion, and began to speak of duty and stability, and the sad necessity of setting aside a queen the country had never truly embraced. He spoke beautifully, he always did. He was midway through his gentle evisceration of her name when the great doors opened, and Queen Consort Rosalind of Veldenmark walked into the chamber. The murmuring stopped. Merrick's smile did not falter, he was far too practiced for that, but something flickered behind his eyes, a first cold touch of doubt. "Your Majesty," he said smoothly, "this is a matter for the council. You need not distress yourself by." "I have a document for the council," Rosalind said, and her voice carried to every corner of the vaulted room, clear and steady and utterly unafraid. "In fact, I have several. I think the ministers will find them more relevant than the petition before them." She laid them on the great table one by one. The kitchen maid's testimony, the quartermaster's ledgers with their damning entries, the physician's supply records, and last, laid down slowly, deliberately, so that every eye in the room followed it, the succession decree, in Merrick's own unmistakable hand. "For a year," she said into the ringing silence, "our king has not been ill, he has been poisoned." Slowly, by careful hands, through the very medicines meant to heal him, prepared by this man's physician, from compounds bought under this man's seal, according to a plan set down in this man's writing. She lifted the decree. "He needed the king weak. He needed the king dying, and he needed me gone, my title stripped, my standing erased, because a queen may challenge a regency, and a discarded consort may not. This petition you were asked to grant today was not the end of his scheme, my lords. It was the final door he needed you to open for him." Merrick's smile was gone now. "This is madness," he said, but the smoothness had cracked, and every minister in the room heard it crack. "Forgeries. The desperate inventions of a woman about to lose everything." "The physician is being questioned as we speak," Rosalind said. "The maid will testify, the ledgers bear your seal, and the decree, Chancellor, the decree is in your hand. Will you tell these men you did not write it? Shall we send for a dozen documents you've signed and lay them beside it?" He did not answer. That was the moment the room turned, not at an accusation, but at a silence, at the sight of a man who smiled widest, suddenly unable to smile at all. They took him from the chamber that afternoon. He did not go gently, but he went, and the great doors closed behind him on the ambition of a lifetime, and the vaulted room let out a breath it felt as though it had held for a year. Aldrich lived. Freed from the poison, nursed back by physicians, Rosalind chose herself and trusted with her life. He climbed slowly out of the grave that had been dug for him inch by patient inch. It was a long road, and he never wholly regained the strength the lost year had stolen. But he lived to see his heir grow steady and sure. He lived to sign, in his own true hand, a decree that named no regency and stripped no queen. that declared instead that Veldenmark had never had a truer consort, nor a monarch a truer wife. And Rosalind, the interloper, the replacement, the woman the country had spent 11 years refusing to love, found that a kingdom which will not give its heart to grace will surrender it, at last, to courage. They did not embrace her overnight. Countries change the way glaciers move, slow and grinding and impossible to see in a single day. But the story traveled, as stories do, of the queen who was meant to be broken, who let the world believe her beaten, and who walked into the lion's own den with the truth in her hands and brought a murderer to his knees. Children learned it. Ballad singers sang it. And somewhere in the retelling, the woman they had called a mistake became the queen they could not imagine having lived without. Years later, when she was old and the lost year was a scar long healed, a young lady of the court asked Rosalind whether she had ever been afraid, in those 5 days when everything hung by a thread. Every moment, Rosalind told her. I was afraid every moment. Then how, the girl asked, did you do it? The old queen smiled, not the whitest smile, but the truest one. Fear is only the wolves telling you where they are, she said. I simply decided to walk toward the sound. The days after Merrick's arrest did not unfold the way Rosalind had imagined them. She had pictured in the sleepless hours before the council some clean moment of triumph, the villain undone, the truth revealed, and then a settling, a quiet, a return to the ordinary rhythm of a life she had nearly lost. But a poison does not leave a body the moment its source is stopped, and a rot does not leave a court the moment its head is cut away. There was work still to be done, and much of it fell to her. The physician broke within a day of questioning. He was not a brave man. Brave men do not spend a year measuring death into a king's cup. And when he understood that Merrick could no longer protect him, he traded every secret he held for the mercy of a swift trial rather than a slow one. What he confessed widened the wound considerably. He gave names. The chancellor had not acted alone. No man hollows out a kingdom by himself. There were ministers who had known or guessed and looked away because looking away was profitable. There were guards who had turned visitors from the king's door on Merrick's word and told themselves it was loyalty. There was a lady of Rosalind's own household, one who had wept with her at breakfast, who had carried her false grief through the court like a torch, who had been reporting the queen consort's every word to the chancellor for the better part of a year. That one cut deepest. Rosalind sat very still when Tomas brought her the name and said nothing for a long moment, and then only, of course, it would have to be someone I trusted or the reports would have been worthless. You are not angry, Tomas observed, watching her. I am too tired to be angry and too changed. She rose and went to the window, to the view of the eastern towers she had looked upon on the morning her whole life cracked open. A month ago the betrayal would have broken something in me. Now I only find myself wondering how many others there are, and whether I will ever again sit at a table without counting the knives. She turned back to him. That is what he stole, Tomas, not just a year of my husband's life. He stole my ease. I will never be an unguarded woman again. But she did not let the wariness harden her into cruelty, and this, more than the courtroom, was the true measure of the queen she had become. When the ministers who had looked away were brought before her, trembling, expecting the vengeance of a woman they had been prepared to discard, she gave them something they had not earned and did not expect. A choice. Confess fully, make restitution, and serve the crown honestly for the rest of their days, or face the courts alongside their chancellor. Most chose confession. A kingdom cannot function if every compromised man is destroyed. She understood that now, understood it the way Aldrich had always understood the grim arithmetic of ruling. Mercy was not weakness. Mercy, deployed with precision, was simply a sharper kind of power. It turned enemies into men who owed her their freedom. The lady who had betrayed her she did not forgive, but neither did she ruin. She had her removed from court quietly, sent to a distant estate with instructions never to return, and let the woman spend the rest of her life wondering why the axe had never fallen. Sometimes the cruelest thing you can grant an enemy is the space to live with what they have done. Aldrich watched all of this from his sickbed, growing stronger by slow degrees, and something shifted in the way he looked at her. He had married her out of grief and loneliness, had come to love her out of gratitude and habit, and had spent 11 years being quietly grateful that she asked so little and gave so much. Now he watched her govern the aftermath of a coup with a steadiness that outmatched his own, and the love that had been soft and comfortable became something else, something closer to awe. I made a mistake, he told her one evening when the candles were low and the palace had gone quiet around them. She looked up from the papers she was reading. Which one? We have a great many to choose from now. His mouth twitched, the ghost of the humor the illness had nearly taken. The petition, revoking your title. I told myself it was the only move, the only way to make Merrick believe he'd won. And perhaps it was. But I have wondered these past nights whether I did it because it was clever or because some cowardly part of me believed the court was right. That you were a thing that could be set aside. That your crown was mine to take because it had always, secretly, been a gift rather than a right. Rosalind set down her papers. This was the conversation she had known was coming, the one she had both dreaded and needed. And what do you believe now? That I very nearly lost the best sovereign this kingdom will ever have, because I could not see her clearly until she was walking into a lion's den to save my life. He reached for her hand. The title was never a gift, Rosalind. You earned it 1,000 times over while the whole country looked away. I am only sorry it took a murderer to make me say so. She held his hand and did not tell him it was all right because it was not, and they were past the point of comfortable lies. But she did not let go either. That was the shape of forgiveness between them now, not a returning to what had been, but a building of something more honest on the cracked foundation of what had nearly been lost. The trial, when it came, was the largest Veldenmark had seen in living memory. Merrick defended himself with all the silvered eloquence that had carried him through 3 reigns, and for a few dangerous hours, it seemed his words might yet cast doubt on the mountain of evidence against him. He was a man who had talked his way out of 100 smaller graves, but he could not talk his way out of his own handwriting, and he could not unsay the physician's confession, and he could not explain why the compounds that had wasted his king had been bought under his seal and delivered to his door. In the end, it was not passion that undid him, but arithmetic, the slow, remorseless accumulation of facts that no eloquence could dissolve. He was found guilty on every count, and when the verdict was read, he turned in the dock and looked, for the first and only time, directly at Rosalind, not with hatred, she thought, but with something almost like professional respect, one strategist acknowledging another across the wreckage of his defeat. She held his gaze and did not look away. She had promised herself, on that first shattered morning, that she would look her enemy in the eyes before he ever laid a claw on her. She had done more than that. She had looked him in the eyes as he was led away to answer for everything he had taken. Life resumed as life does. Not the old life that was gone, buried with the year the poison stole, but a new one, quieter in some ways and richer in others. The heir grew into his role with Rosalind's steady hand to guide him and Aldrich's slow-returning wisdom to counsel him, and the boy who might have been a puppet on a murderer's counsel became, in time, a young man his people could trust. Tomas she rewarded past all his protests, settling on him a pension and a cottage and a standing invitation to the palace he could use whenever the old halls called to him. He used it often. He had spent 30 years as invisible furniture. He spent his last years as a friend the Queen received without appointment, and he counted it the finest turn his long life ever took. And the country came around, as she had known in her bones it eventually would, because there is nothing a people love so well as a story of courage, and Rosalind had given them the finest one in a generation. The frost that had never quite thawed melted at last into something she had stopped daring to hope for. Not respect alone now, but affection. Not tolerance, but pride. She was theirs, and they had nearly let a smiling man take her from them, and the shame of how close they had come made them love her all the fiercer for having kept her. She never forgot how it had felt to be unwanted. That was perhaps the secret of the rain that followed that she remembered always, what it was to stand outside the warmth and be judged unworthy of it. It made her merciful to the overlooked. It made her patient with the doubted. It made her, in the fullness of time, exactly the queen the country had spent 11 years insisting she could never be. And on quiet mornings, when the sun climbed over the eastern towers and gilded the stones the way it had on the day her life first cracked apart, Rosalind would stand at her window and press her hand flat against the cool glass, and remember the frightened woman who had made herself a promise there. She had kept it, every word of it. She had not gone quietly. She had learned the name of the thing that came for her, and she had walked toward the sound of the wolves until there were no wolves left at all.